You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking to the Physician of Fright himself, Dr. Gangrene. That's right, we talked to Dr. Gangrene about horror hosting, horror movies, his career, and entering into the Rondo Hall of Fame. Here we go. By way of a secret lab on Shackle Island, the doctor is in, or better yet, insane, at the Cinematarium where all movies are mad, courtesy of our guest, the Rondo Award Monster Kid Hall of Fame member, the one, the only, Dr. Gangrene, a.k.a. Larry Underwood. Larry, Dr. Gangrene, thank you for coming on the Fan2Fan Podcast.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for that great intro. Appreciate you inviting me onto the show.
From Chicago, I had the privilege, the honor of growing up with Svengoolie. And from Jerry Bishop, when he handed off the reins to the son of Svengoolie, Rich Koz, I remember Rich Koz doing the weather and the sports, and he would do like a chit-chat kind of a parody on the Fox affiliate growing up. And I felt like I grew up growing up as Rich was kind of finding his voice and finding how technology was evolving from being a Fox affiliate to working with now MeTV to now being national. I think he was kind of like my gateway to understand horror hosts. So as Nashville's premier horror host, to get to know more about you, because obviously horror hosting, it's in your blood.
And you grew up as Rich's character grew up, you know, it'd be from the son to straight up just Svengoolie. So that's kind of cool. That whole area is really rich in horror host history. So that's good. It's a good place to grow up. I grew up here in Nashville, and Sir Cecil Creep was my guy back in the 1970s.
Is Creature Feature, exploring the realm of the unknown. And now, from deep within the catacombs beneath our studio, here is your master of ceremonies, Sir Cecil Creep.
I was really glad to continue in his footsteps and keep that tradition going here in Music City.
And I heard in one of your interviews that you grew up in more of like a conservative household, which I think we had that very much in common. My parents were very religious. I was always in church on weekends, Wednesday nights. I think similar to you, prohibited us from watching certain kinds of movies because our folks didn't want us to watch those kind of movies.
Yep. And that forbidden fruit is all that much sweeter. Yeah. My parents were definitely, it was church every Sunday, and there was unless you were just running a fever and throwing up, there was no getting out of it. It was every Sunday. And then Wednesday nights, like you're talking about, you know, we were Methodist church, and it was like the clockwork. Yeah, there was no horror movies at the house, except for, you know, the Universals and things like that. Those were my gateway into horror, and those were fine. You know, they're fun, they're goofy. We had in the afternoons, weekday afternoons, there was a show locally called The Big Show that would show monster movies. They showed all kinds of stuff. Like they would show film noir and action, but when they showed the monster movies, oh man, I was all about it. I would flip over there and watch. So my first movies I saw, you know, horror movies were Frankenstein, Dracula, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Wolfman, all the classics. So that's what I cut my teeth on.
The scariest creatures in Hollywood rise from their graves. Every Saturday at 3 p.m. on Creepy Classics.
Next time, an expedition in the Amazon turns into a nightmare when a group of scientists comes face to face with the creature from the Black Lagoon. Saturday at 3 p.m. on AMC's Creepy Classics.
with those universal monsters that ties in very much with like the whole horror host theme. So it seems like you were primed at a young age to maybe not you were destined to become a horror host, but that early DNA seemed to be instilled in you from those early universal monster movies.
Yeah, they're just so great. They really are perfect gateway films into the world because they're a little bit spooky. They're black and white, so they're got that otherworldly quality about them, and they got such production value. You know, they're so well made. They're so much fun to watch. I mean, those Creature from the Black Lagoon and Revenge of the Creature are such excellent movies. And The Wolfman, I mean, come on, doesn't get any better than The Wolfman.
Did your parents let you watch these movies, or were these things that you kind of had to like sneak in and watch on Wednesday afternoon or on the weekends or things like that?
So those they would let me watch, but the weekday show, the big show actually came on in the afternoons. So I remember very clearly staying at my grandmother's after school, and she would let me watch. And we had this whole afternoon long series of great programming that I got to watch. The Spider-Man 60s cartoon and Batman, Gilligan's Island, and the Munsters and the Addams Family and the Big Show. All that stuff, all of it, throw it all into a pot and stir it up. And yeah, that's what got me going.
I definitely want to stay with like your early formative years here, but like you mentioned Gilligan's Island, and it triggered something because I was thinking about with your vibe as Dr. Gangrene and like a lot of horror hosts where there's that element of like goofiness to it, and it's a lot about having fun and just, you know, slapstick and then all that. And I was remembering that there was a Gilligan's Island episode and an episode of the Monkees as well, where they're like either in a haunted house or like, you know, there's like a mad scientist thing. And both of those episodes are ingrained in my brain in some way. And they both, to me, feel like they've got that spirit of like what you as a horror host and what a lot of horror hosts kind of bring to the role of just that madcap, zany fun. And I don't know if any of that, like that Gilligan's Island episode, rubbed off on you at all, or if you try to instill any of that into what you do as Dr. Gangrene.
100%. You nailed it. Gilligan's Island, I have always claimed is one of my major influences for especially the first show, Chiller Cinema, the very first show that I did. It was just a half hour long, so it was a lot of skit-based things.
Chiller.
The humor that's goofy, fun, lighthearted. People even have referred to that show, and really all my shows, but that one in particular as a kid's show sometimes. It had that kind of wholesome feel to it, and that was very much intentional. I think being a new parent at the time kind of also played into that. But I've always said it's kind of a cross between Gilligan's Island and the Addams Family, or Gilligan's Island and the Munsters is probably more close. Those are the things that I was kind of trying to mash together. And Alice Cooper, kind of throw all that in and mix it up. And that's what it was.
The Big Show reminds me a lot, Pete, when you've talked about growing up on Long Island in Pix and how they would have the Godzilla marathons where every day, kind of like after you would come home from school, you'd get to see Monster Zero, Son of Godzilla.
And now the Godzilla-thon begins. He's mean, green, and making the New York scene with 4 of his favorite films. Starting with Godzilla's Revenge. He doesn't get mad, he gets even. Stay tuned and tally the score.
In my neck of the woods, it was the Fox affiliate that introduced me to Explorers, The Navigators, those movies that were kind of Spielbergian, but then occasionally they would throw something like The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. That would blow my mind because I'm watching Hogan's Heroes, Gilligan's Island, Chips, Knight Rider on any given day during the summer, running home when I can to watch The Monkees or like Ultraman. And then here's this movie. Is this the landlord from Three's Company? Like, I don't understand what's going on here. But that movie had that nice balance of campiness. That is part of the DNA of your show, where it's not necessarily straight out horror, but that you're really introducing almost like a family friendliness. But it seems like that's kind of part of your DNA, is that you're purposely doing that.
Oh yeah, very much so. You know, I make the show for myself first and foremost, which is something that I've always kind of steered other or advised other horror hosts, people who have come to me and asked me for advice on, you know, what advice would you give me if I want to start my own show? I was like, do the kind of show you want to watch, do what interests you. And, there's no right and wrong answer. There's no formula that's, the magic formula. It's like, do what you like. That way, no matter what, even if the show doesn't take off or whatever, you're going to be happy with the end product, which is ultimately going to keep you going longer also. That humor and campiness and lighthearted humor is all, that's all me.
Zombies, ghouls, the living dead. Join us here on Creature Feature, Saturday, October 13th at 7 p.m. You'll have more fun than a zombie and a brain buffet. There you go.
Okay, here you go.
Were you kind of a class clown at all in school growing up? Were you like looking to seek the spotlight now that you have kind of, forged your own little corner of the world here as Dr. Gangrene? Like, was there something in you growing up that was like, I need to perform, I need to do something like this?
Very much not at all. I was not the class clown. I was a nerd. I was, I won't say that people didn't know who I was, but I think, I was definitely more outsider for sure.
We're all kind of sponges, though. It seems like in those very formative years, like you mentioned, Alice Cooper, was music a big part? Is that how you kind of discovered a little bit more of that outside, maybe slightly less conservative world?
No, I remember very plainly when I discovered Alice Cooper. I was at my grandmother's house again, and my uncle's bedroom upstairs, he had moved out, and I was just going through his stuff, and I found this box and got it out of the closet and opened it up, and there were all these cassette tapes in there. And there was a cassette tape of Alice Cooper Goes to Hell, Alice Cooper's the first solo album, the Welcome to My Nightmare. They blew my mind. I was like, oh, this is it. This is the greatest thing ever. Music really wasn't a big part of my background growing up until really high school. Pretty much when I got to high school, I was all about music. I discovered Ozzy Osbourne. It was on, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath and Alice Cooper and all the hair bands. My first concert was Ozzy and Motley Crue at the Municipal Auditorium in Nashville. Great show. And that I always tried to work that into my show because I would have music videos on Chiller Cinema. So that was a regular part of it. I would work that back in. And of course, the black around the eyes was kind of like Alice Cooper, tribute to him, doing the black circles around the eyes. So I think that's kind of where I picked that up. You pull pieces and parts from different, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. You find later, you may not even know why you're doing it at the time, but you think about it later and you realize, oh yeah, I could see where I got that from. Okay.
The real Dr. Frankenstein there. Taking parts from everywhere.
Greetings, Fright fans, and welcome to day 17 of our Halloween countdown, our Monsters Run Wild, Mad Scientist Monsters Run Wild countdown this year. The rules are it has to have a mad scientist and he has to create a monster that runs wild. So there you go. All right, tonight we're going to look at a true classic. We looked at the Hammer Horror series and we looked at Curse of Frankenstein. We also looked at the Universal series. So I wanted to spotlight one film in particular, one that was so influential, deserved to have its own entry, and that is Frankenstein.
Now, I love that idea, too, the fact that you discover Alice Cooper at Grandma's house.
Absolutely. She's the one that let me watch all those monster movies in the afternoons, too. So I got to tip my hat to her. I remember one of the last things she's passed away now, but I do remember a conversation, one of the last ones where she was kind of making fun of me she's like, yeah, you sure? Making fun about Batman. You used to watch that Batman every afternoon.
That's the great thing about grandparents is that they let you get away with so much more than what your parents do. Like my grandmother it wasn't necessarily the horror stuff, but like she would let us play cards with her all the time. And my grandmother had 10 kids. So I had like a ton of cousins growing up, and she would be like, you're so good at cards. When you get old enough, I'm taking you to Vegas. And we thought that was like the greatest thing ever until we found out later she told every one of the grandkids that. We thought that was like unique to us. Like, oh, I'm so good at cards. Like, no, Grammy said that about everyone.
Like I said, my parents didn't let me watch that stuff, but I got to say later, and once I started the show and everything, my mom was very supportive and very much all about it. And, we shot stuff at her house, and, the Dreadful Halloween special that I did with Penny Dreadful, I shot most of Dr. Gangrene's bit. I probably 75% of it in the lab scenes there. I built a little set down in her basement just because we had so much room down there. As opposed, I want it to look like a different set from my regular set too. So we went over there and built a different set. And for one of the movies we made. They rented a backhoe, and she let me see. They had a lot of property, and we dug a 6-foot hole. And had some grave diggers out there. So yeah, she was all about supporting me, and was great.
One of the first conversations we had was at the Full Moon Cineplex. So shout out to Ben and Stacy. And we were talking about comics. And as a comic artist myself, and obviously you've drawn comics, you've published comics, you've made comics. Where did comics kind of fall into place, while you're watching some of these movies at grandma's house, listening to some of this music and finding your own path?
Oh, comics were my first love. That was like, they obsessed me. That was my main thing growing up. That's what probably kept me sane. Just absolutely loved Spider-Man comics, but I loved horror comics in particular. I loved all the Marvel horror series like Chamber of Chills, and I think there was Tower of Evil or something. But any of that stuff I could find, especially Chamber of Chills, I remember really, really liked that, which later found out were reprints from some older horror comics that Marvel was repackaging, putting out. But that stuff, man, that was my favorite. So, and that's, again, kind of horror hosty. It's all kind of related.
Vault of Horror has the Vault Keeper, right? You've got Uncle Creepy with, Creepy. To your point, most of them did have a horror host that was kind of guiding you through those anthology style stories. And, they would just give you that sort of like snarky intro, twist ending. But you knew that whatever story you were going to get, whether it was like Victorian age or a bunch of soldiers in World War II, that horror host was going to be consistent.
Oh, yeah, 100%. The EC Comics, I don't think there's ever been a better stable of artists than the artists for EC Comics. I mean, those guys were all just rock stars, every one of them. That formula, that bunch of short films tied together with the host has influenced so many writers, artists, directors. You go on and on. It's a big reason why horror anthologies are my favorite genre. I mean, you and I were discussing some of the posters I have up here. I've got Tales from the Crypt, original poster, and Creep Show in here. Those are two of my very favorite movies of all time. And that's basically what they are. They're horror host films, basically.
The Vault of Horror is about to open. You will learn its terrifying secrets if you dare. Death lives in Tales from the Crypt, from Cinerama Releasing. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Some material may be unsuitable for pre-teenagers.
The comic had the Cryptkeeper, who was very different from the Cryptkeeper from the HBO series, just as far as like aesthetics, but they still kept that. It's neat that the Tales of the Crypt that I think a lot of people are probably more familiar with, the HBO series, leaned into the comedy instead of playing it straight, where the Tales from the Crypt from, I think that was mid-70s, Larry, is that right?
Yeah, it was early 70s, and yeah, they played it straight. Ralph Richardson, I believe, was the Cryptkeeper in that, and he's not in makeup or anything. He's just, just a guy in a robe. But it is early, it's an early version of the first adaptation of Tales from the Crypt. It's still great. I love the segments, and it's got 5 segments in it, which I think is the perfect amount for a horror anthology. It works perfect. And it's got the Killer Santa, absolutely great. And then it's got the one with Peter Cushing as the corpse that comes back on Valentine's Day. And those 2 segments right there are so good. That Peter Cushing one is so touching and heartrending when that guy just continues driving him to his, basically to kill him to the point where he kills himself. It's great.
Horror host icons that we've grown up with, like the Elviras, the Svengulis, but even before that, like the Zackerleys or the Chili Billy, right? Not all of them wore the eye black and the cape. In some ways, like even like Rod Serling and Hitchcock were not necessarily horror hosts in the way we think of it, or in the way that like you have Dr. Gangrene, but they were guiding audiences. So it's like in some ways that's almost like a more like masses friendly version. Here's a guy and he's chain smoking on screen and he's wearing a jacket, but he's telling you the morality tale. Well, he's not a horror host. I don't know. I saw Hitchcock do a lot of good spoofs and parodies and snarky jokes. That's no different than the stuff that you do on your show.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel, tucked away off the main highway, and as you see, perfectly harmless looking, when in fact, it has now become known as the scene of the crime.
Oh, it's the same. Yeah, absolutely the same. I think and those shows are the ones that I watch reruns of. Yeah, I watch them all the time. I have a Roku and pull up on Pluto. They have channels with just running that stuff all the time. And anytime I'm just sitting around and want to throw something on that's shorter, easily digestible, I'll put a Hitchcock Presents or Hitchcock Hour on or a Twilight Zone. There's Twilight Zone. This seems to show a lot of the same episodes over and over, though. But I do like that channel also shows the little preview at the end of each episode for the following one, because that's what, as a kid watching those, which I did watch regularly. And next week, stay tuned, because we've got a show about a guy that blah, blah, blah. I think that's pretty neat.
That was happening at the same time EC Comics is happening, that Hitchcock is happening. I think Vampira was in LA in like the mid 50s. That's happening. Shock. That's when, like, was it Columbia that they had licensed like that catalog of movies? We come from a place, just like you mentioned, Larry, like we have Pluto, Tubi, streaming is easy. At that time, your grandmother's growing up with a handful, literally 4 or 5 stations, and maybe not all of them coming great. And then all of a sudden there's an explosion. There's TV channels that are popping up left and right in the 40s into the 50s. You got to fill out the time. What do? You throw on Dracula at midnight, and maybe there's a weatherman who likes Dracula. So then you go to him and say, hey, Billy, you want to just go ahead and introduce it? I don't know. What am I doing? I don't know. You'll figure it out. And then you get Bob Wilkins, was it Creature Features? And all those guys just kind of do their thing, and they start, I don't know, there's like a silhouette that they start kind of building of what we think of as horror hosts.
It was all in the air at that time. 1957 is when the Shock package came on television. And that's the first time the Universals had ever been shown on TV. It was all Universal films licensed through Columbia. So you're right. Great stuff. Kids, I can imagine being a kid in the 1950s. And for the first time ever, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, all those mummy movies. That was must-watch TV for those kids at that time, for sure.
Greetings, all you selling freaks, you hyper-alcoholic geeks. We welcome you with bated breath to yet another year of death, of murder foul 'neath full moon's rise, as monsters haunt and terrorize. New creature features now we bring to help us do our horror thing. And backed by popular demand, our older fiends from Monsterland, daughters, sons of Frankenstein, mummies, werewolves, all divine, will haunt the midnight Vidicon, and Channel 9 will get it on.
And it's such a different world too, where we can just easily, like you said, you love the movie that you saw in the theater, assuming you saw it in the theater, not on Netflix, and you enjoyed it so much you want to watch it tomorrow. Just hit play, find a thumbnail and hit play. These movies are coming out in the 1930s, 40s, and if you weren't old enough or your parents weren't willing to take you to see Frankenstein, but now this random channel that you get in a little grainy, but just close enough at 10 p.m. on a Saturday is airing one of the Creature from the Black Lagoon movies.
Yeah, it was a phenomenon for sure. And then you had that monster explosion in the 1950s, and then the Addams Family and the Munsters came on, and so good. But yeah, all those TV anthologies fed right into that. They were all feeding off the same zeitgeist. Everything was in the air. The monster model kits were coming out, and all this stuff was happening all at once. What a great time. And all those 50s in the theaters, you had all those great 50s science fiction films that were out there, Tarantula, them, and so many great movies in that period, And
I think didn't you have an intro from John Agar's son or great grandson?
It was his son. John Agar III. He shot an intro for us. Yeah, which I put that on YouTube so everybody can see it. What's great about him, I know him because I interviewed him for Scary Monsters magazine. A really nice guy. But what's great about him is how appreciative, and you can hear it in that intro, how appreciative he is of the fans and the fact that they all still remember his dad so fondly. He's told me so many times, Larry, nobody's done more to keep my dad's memory alive than you, because I've done music videos and I did a top 10 John Agar countdown on that. He said it pops up all the time for him, and talked about him in magazines and, on podcasts. And I called him and asked him if he'd shoot me a little intro. He's like, whatever you need, Doc. For you, you got it, man. You've done more to keep my dad's memory alive than anybody. I'll be happy to do that for you. He's, like I said, just really appreciative. And, his dad, he made a lot of what would be considered B pictures. John Agar Sr., his dad would be proud to know that people still remember him fondly. Some of them weren't the best, but he always gave his best. And he's always fun to watch in them. And he makes them like, I did another podcast recently where we talked about Hand of Death. I don't know if you've seen that one, but he basically morphs into what looks like the Thing from the Fantastic Four in it. It's a monster movie. John's not, you don't see him as himself out of makeup for that much of the movie, but not what you would call a great movie by any stretch, but he makes it fun for me. I'm a big John Agar fan.
Dr. Gangrene back here with another recommended movie of the week, and this week's movie is Tarantula. Tarantula was directed by Jack Arnold, the guy that did The Creature from the Black Lagoon, among a lot of other great movies, and it stars John Agar, one of my favorite actors, because everybody knows John Agar.
And for generations of us that grew up on those movies, I think now we could look back at them and be like, yeah, maybe they weren't the best, but when you're a kid and your imagination is just like firing off of all these ideas, whether they were leading actors or character actors, like they're embedded in all our brains. And so they all hold a very special place for someone like you that is able to, give that recognition in ways that, we can have a podcast and talk about it, or we can talk about it amongst friends. But, as Dr. Gangrene, like you have a unique position to like really call into like, hey, John Agar, like this guy was putting in some work on maybe some questionable films in his career, but that didn't slow him down. Like he was there to give a performance, and there's thousands, if not millions of us that have a great appreciation for those performances.
For sure. And his dad caught a lot of flack over the whole Shirley Temple thing when it went south. It's like, how dare you, treat America's sweetheart that way? And he had a drinking problem in his time. And so I think he had a lot of things working against him. And now all this time later, I just really think he'd be very proud to know that people appreciate his work. After all, the work stands the test of time. I mean, look at the Mole People. How great is that movie? It's just fun. Daughter of Dr. Jekyll, The Tarantula, a lot of great movies. Puppet People, Attack of Puppet People, The Brain from Planet Eros. Could go on and on. They're all fun.
Talking about appreciation, because I know you said you weren't able to see Sir Cecil's movies necessarily growing up, but the patch that you have on your lab coat, you mentioned it's from a Boy Scout patch, right? Your tribute, your celebration of those that came before you here. Dr. Lucifer, who was maybe the first host in the Nashville area in the 50s and 60s. Obviously, Sir Cecil, and obviously you're kind of doing it now with Dr. Gangrene. But how did you discover those horror hosts? Obviously, now with a little bit of hindsight, as you're kind of doing your thing, and how you kind of found out what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just word of mouth. You get talking to people like, oh, yeah, did you know Dr. Lucifer? And I met a guy named Jeff Thompson, who's a friend of mine that lives here local. And he used to work at a radio station with Ken Bramming, who played Dr. Lucifer back in the 1950s up into the early 1960s. And when Ken passed away, he gifted Jeff with his scrapbook of photos and the last surviving footage of himself, the only surviving footage of himself in costume, which is the open and close of his show, because that was shot on film Everything else was done live because that's how television was done back then. It was all live. And unless somebody just happened to point a film camera at a television and shoot a kinescope, it doesn't exist. We didn't have videotape back then. So that intro and outro were shot on film. And so that does exist. But Jeff introduced himself to me at some point really early on in the show and said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see someone's doing this." And, I worked with Ken Brammy. He was Dr. Lucifer, and everything about my show has been really tributes to Sir Cecil from day one. The reason I started the show is because I wanted to put the kind of show on the air that Sir Cecil Creep had done in the 70s that got me so fired up. Even though I didn't get to watch it, my parents wouldn't let me actually watch the actual program. I tried to stay up late. I would try to talk them into it, and I'd stick around. My mom said that I used to love to watch Mannix. If I had to guess, I would guess Mannix probably came on right before Creature Feature. I don't know that, but I need to look and see when it came. But she said that was one of my favorite shows. But everything about my show has been a tribute. I started because I wanted to do that same kind of show. I put the patch. Once I started thinking about it, I remembered, wait a minute, when I got that scouting patch, and my mom had saved all of my scout patches and sewed them on a blue jean jacket. So I went and pulled that off. And I pulled the one off my brother's jacket, too. So I have two of them. And I sewed that on my lab coat as a tribute to Sir Cecil Creep. And we've done tributes over the years. And I would regularly end my program with the words, "Dedicated to the memories of Russ McCown and Ken Braming, horror hosts legends of Nashville." And then just last year, I was able to help get a historical marker put in Nashville for Russ McCown as sort of the ultimate tribute to the old boy. He's the first host in the whole country to have a permanent historical marker erected in his honor. It's so great to see everybody out here. Thank you all for showing up. Like they said, my name's Larry Underwood. I've hosted a horror host show in Nashville for 25 years as Dr. Gangrene, inspired by this guy right here. So I'm going to start it the way Russ started his show every week. Did someone call? Today I want to take you back in time to when late night television was a bit spookier and a lot more fun. Imagine turning on your TV in Nashville in the early 1970s, which I'm sure a lot of you out here did, flipping through the channels and stumbling upon a quirky character named Sir Cecil Creep, hosting creaky old horror movies from a dripping underground dungeon. Sir Cecil Creep was the creation of Russ McCown, a film editor at WSM-TV Channel 4. McCown, who had a knack for the theatrical and a love for film, brought Sir Cecil to life in 1971 as the host of Creature Feature that aired at 10:30 Saturday nights. We chose this location for the historical marker as Russ used to own this very home. As I said before, a historic foursquare he took great pride in restoring and maintaining. Thank you for taking this journey with me back in time, where horror met humor and Sir Cecil Creep ruled the airwaves. I'd like to close with the same words Sir Cecil spoke at the end of each episode, and if you know it, you can say it along with me. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the Betty bugs bite. That was a big deal for me, and I'm really proud we were able to get that done. So yeah, doing those tributes and remembering the ones that came before is super important to me, and it's something that I've tried to do from day one with the show.
And I thought I heard you say somewhere, is it true Dr. Lucifer did the voiceover for Sir Cecil's intro?
He did. He did the voice that was the intro. And I wrote for for Chiller Cinema in the later years of it, decided to do a whole new intro and wanted some different music. So I talked some friends of mine into forming a band called The Exotic Ones that still exists today. They formed to record my theme song and purposefully asked one. We were just talking about this weekend. My friend Troy Gwynn, his dad, Gerald, has a great voice. Has a kind of a deep voice, and all the Gwynns have the same kind of deep voice, but Gerald in particular. So I said, Troy, I want your dad to do an intro for me. And I was in my mind thinking about Sir Cecil Creep's intro for Creature Feature. So I wrote up this. Shackle Island doesn't exist on any maps or navigational, navigational charts. It's a place of myth, They wrote this whole intro exactly to kind of get the feel, capture the flavor of that Sir Cecil Creep intro, and had his dad voice it. So that was a lot of fun.
I love that, just like that tradition where Ken kind of paid it forward. Sir Cecil inspired you and then you pay it forward. This is kind of a small community. Like you said, like you talk to other folks because there's not many people doing it. And when someone does it for any length of time, I think you've said you've even had some horror hosts kind of approach you for advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a nice little, what's the word for it? Fraternity. Those of us who have done this, certainly I'm not getting paid for it. Russ was paid. He was paid, and probably Ken was paid as well back in those days, you know. But for me, it's all for the love of the genre, and it's a creative expression. You know, I've had that thought a lot of times in my head. Why do I do this? What makes me keep doing this 30 years, 25 years, going to, 25, 26 now years later? And for me, it's just a creative expression. I'm not doing art anymore, but I get that creative urge out, that itch scratched by doing this show. That's where my creativity is spent now. There's certainly weirder hobbies or more expensive hobbies that other people have. I mean, there's guys that go golfing every weekend and spend thousands of dollars on clubs and course fees and, golf clothes. How's that any weirder than what I do? Okay, maybe it's not as weird as what I do, but you know what I'm saying.
Golf clubs versus shooting in your backyard in your shed.
Yeah, we've now graduated from the shed to a bedroom of the house. Central heat and air are magnificent.
I think that probably helps with the longevity of your career. Like if you're I think it's admirable that you're not doing this as a career to make money, but like to be 25, 30 years on, if you're still in your shed, that would be a level of dedication that some might call maybe pathological, but thankfully you don't have to do that.
I think I would be dead. It would be 90 degrees in that shed in the summertime and probably, 35 in the winter. There was a time, and I've told this story before too, where we were shooting one night and we wanted a fog effect. So my hunchback character, Brandon, who played Oogsley, got down beside the camera, started breathing in front of the camera to make this smoke effect. And it worked. We were making do with the space we had. I moved to a new house and it had this nice big shed out there, but it had a second shed that was connected to it. So it was kind of two sheds that were put together. Really, it had a lot of room to spread out in there. And so we used the back half just for props, and we walk in and out off screen into that side. But the main set, I built a lab on one side and like brick walls and a swinging bookcase on the other. So we would shoot on one side and then flip the camera around and shoot on the other. So we tried to really, and then I built like a third and fourth set on the other two walls. So we really tried to maximize, if it's not on screen, it doesn't exist. But, right inside that little frame is all that matters. And we just made it work. Like, this is the space we have. We'll go for it. Central heat and air be damned.
Well, I was going to say, you've talked a lot about, I think, in your interviews with collaboration, like you've had like a great group of people that have worked with you. And I have to imagine that makes all the difference in the world. Because I feel like the horror hosts, there's like that DIY aesthetic and vibe to a lot of them that, a lot of it, I think, is just like what you were just talking about, is just born out of necessity. I think you've made mention before, like you kind of knew what you didn't know when you started doing this. It's like, I don't know how to create a TV program or a half-hour show. I'm just going to do it. But I have to imagine when it's 30 degrees out in December or it's 98 degrees out in August, if you don't have a group of people that you're collaborating with to kind of push you to get out there and be like, okay, I know it's 30 degrees, but we got to do this. So we got to get out there. That has to really help propel you along during some of those rougher times.
Absolutely. And I started the show with Chuck Angel, who was my creative partner at the time, who had worked in comic books with me. He was my comic book partner. Chuck had some experience on the other side of the camera. He was a filmmaker, loved shooting. He didn't like being in front of the camera. So it was a perfect partnership, because I wanted to act the fool in front of the camera and he wanted to be behind it, and we would shoot it and he would edit half the episodes and I would edit half the episodes. And it was a nice way to split the work up so neither of us was getting too overwhelmed. And that dynamic absolutely worked. And then eventually Chuck went on to work on other things and other people came in and eventually my most recent partner that I've worked with for a lot of years is Cameron McCaslin, who is another filmmaker who I invited to come shoot with me. But there's been a lot of people who've contributed both as actors and set designers and running camera for me. I've said, pretty much that especially back then, if you're around when we're filming, I'm going to put you on in an episode. You're going to get dragged into it one way or another. And I think most people had fun with it.
You'll get a fun name like Nurse Monique, Johnny the Zombie, Oogsley the Hunchback, like you were talking about, or Lump, R.I.P. Paul Browning. And you had even said in one of the early ones, and you were kind of doing the gag on the audience where you were playing both characters. But I think kind of like to Pete's point, like it seems like the DIY aspect is as much as like the collaboration. You're trying to bring in people and bring in those perspectives. It's you're welcoming some of that. And I did listen to one of your interviews. You were talking about Image 10, Romero and that crew. It seems like that's a little bit of an inspiration for you.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of goes back to my comic book days when we were starting to do comic books. We didn't have any money and we were broke. I mean, I was working for peanuts back then and was married with kids. I had a kid. My wife had a kid. And Chuck's in the same boat. It's like, how are we going to find money to publish these comic books? And there was no print on demand back then. If you wanted to print books, you got to print 1,000 at a time. So we were trying to figure out ways to make money. And I ran across an interview with Romero talking about Image 10 and how it was 10 guys who all pulled their money together to get the money to make this film. And I was like, we could do something like that on a much smaller scale. So for the next anthologies, first book, we borrowed the money from his parents and used that money and paid them back from the sales. And we kind of worked like that for a while until we got to one of the anthologies, and I hit on this idea. And so there was a group of, I think, 5 of us. And so we all pooled our money together and we printed 100 T-shirts. And I said, if all of us sell each of these 20 T-shirts each, and then we'll get the $1,000 to print our book. So we flipped, the little bit of money that it cost us to get these T-shirts done into, a lot more money that we could then use to print the comic books. So yeah, but it was absolutely George Romero, who you talk about DIY. That's the ultimate DIY. That's what I love about that film, and Romero in particular, is that whole DIY aesthetic, and that Pittsburgh area is such a creative hotbed up there. Love all the work of all those guys up there that in that little area, that little crew. Have you ever seen a movie called Effects? Yeah, it's done by one of the Romero guys, and it has Joe is it Pilati? Yeah, he's one of the main actors in it, and it's about a movie that's being filmed. And then there's a twist in there where you see there's more going on besides they're shooting a horror movie. And then it turns out that there's another layer beyond. There's something else going on. And but it's really good. I really love that. It's an underrated, unknown, lesser known little horror movie it's on Tubi that I always try to recommend to folks. But it's got that Pittsburgh feel. Romero's Martin. I love the feel of that movie. The buildings and the way things look, and it's set in the 70s. Of course, it's made in the 70s, so the wardrobe and everything, and it's an awesome movie. Romero was the master.
I don't want to sidetrack us too much, but I just read this the other day. I don't know if you both saw this, but Ken Foree from Dawn of the Dead came out and gave like an impassioned plea to save the Monroeville Mall, which is up for sale. Well, it's not up for sale. It's been sold to Walmart. And so he was talking about like, whatever, can we make this a national landmark? He's like, I don't know if it warrants it, but like we had to do something.
We went up there and invested, it's a great film, but if Walmart bought it, it's done. They're single-handedly have probably torn down more drive-in theaters than any other business out there.
The Romero story, Larry, that reminds me a lot too. Like when I first discovered him, and I think again we have a very similar upbringing. Where I think for me, it wasn't a grandmother that gave me permission or access to some of this. It was college, being away from my parents, going to a video store, and not having someone tell me, no, you can't rent this, but you can rent that.
Video. It's the only way to get what you want to watch when you want to watch it. Action, adventure, horror, comedy, drama, suspense, romance. Great entertainment. Always a great value.
Video, it's what you want to watch.
These movies and many more are available at your local video store.
At that point, I just went A to Z in the horror section. And by the time you get to end, you see this movie that seems to be in every issue of Fangoria. But man, this movie, Night of the Living Dead, I don't get it. It's in black and white. That's old. I don't understand. And I get these AFI lists with Citizen Kane, but I'd rather just watch Halloween 4 10 more times. That's fine. But I'm a completionist. I got to watch Night of the Living Dead. And it blew my mind. And it was, I think, the first black and white movie that gave me permission to watch other black and white movies without that whole baggage that it's black and white, so it has to be old. Not at all. Night of the Living Dead felt modern. It felt timely. And I think for me, it made me want to learn more about Romero. Wait, so this guy did a Calgon commercial, and then he uses the money for that to then be able to make Night Riders or Crazies or some of these other movies that I also love. But that sort of idea of, yeah, but he's still doing it with folks that you see in all his movies, in front or behind the camera. So there is that DIY collaboration. He's got a crew. That's that Pittsburgh crew, just like you've got your Nashville crew.
That whole Pittsburgh area, that whole feel of things up there. But yeah, he definitely had a crew that, is they all worked together, like Michael Gornick would shoot one thing and then he would direct something else, or Tom Savini works, as an actor first and makeup later, and those guys all worked on each other's stuff. But yeah, Night of the Living Dead is absolutely one of the great films of all time, not just horror films, but films of all time. And that ending is such a gut punch. I mean, it just has such and not just the racial part of it, that's part of it too, but just because you're so invested in this guy, that ending though, wow. I mean, everybody's seen this. We're not spoiling anything.
Yeah. No. Dwayne Jones does such a great job of portraying him as like, you're so rooting for him, and then you think, oh, well, they're going to win at the end. He wins, he gets it. And then, nope, it's not going to be a happy ending here.
This is the sound of a normal heart. Now, listen to that same heart subjected to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead. The dead who live on living flesh. The dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the living dead. A bizarre adventure in fear, an experience in shock more shattering than your strangest nightmare. Night of the living dead. A night of total terror.
All right, and that was the end of part 1 of our conversation with Dr. Gangrene. Make sure to listen to part 2, where we'll talk about his early career, the evolution of his career, and we'll just get into so much more, including Dr. Gangrene's induction into the Rondo Hall of Fame. Amazing conversation. Loved going through this in part 1, so make sure to tune in into part 2, and make sure to check out Dr. Gangrene's website, drgangrene.com, where you'll find information about his videos, his store, his blog. You can contact him, so much more, and his YouTube page at Dr. Gangrene, where he hosts a ton of his videos, his 25th anniversary show, different movie reviews. Check it all out, drgangrene.com. And thank you for listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast.